China's influence across the globe has grown even further this year. President Xi Jinping stood up to President Trump on tariffs, and China's economic growth is now set to reach 5% for the year. One New York Times best-selling author predicts China could soon surpass the US in terms of the global power it wields. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, China has enjoyed another hugely impressive year, but already President Xi is planning ahead with ambitions to double its GDP from 2020 levels to $28 trillion by 2035. The focus will be on artificial intelligence, clean energy, and 6G telecommunications. It is an audacious plan with plenty of risk. And to look at what they've done and where they're going, I'm delighted to say I'm joined in the studio now by Dan Wang. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Dan, welcome to Roundtable.
Great to be here, Enda.
Fabulous to have you. Now tell me, there was one line in your book that really jumped out at me. You say China is a country that moves fast and breaks things, moves fast and breaks people. What did you mean by that?
Well, Silicon Valley, where I'm coming to you from, is a place that moves fast and breaks things. Silicon Valley, it's a place that has created a lot of really big projects. And I think of China as a place that has created so many big projects. One way to really understand China over the last 40 years is that they've engaged in these giant spasms of construction, building everything like roads and bridges and coal, nuclear, solar, as well as so many homes across the entire country. And they are also social engineers. They're also population engineers, and they treat the population as yet another building material to be torn down and remolded as they wish. And that is a lot of what my book, Breakneck, is trying to explore, how they are sometimes moving fast to break things, but also moving fast to break people.
And tell me as well, you say that it is a country that is always in motion. You're originally from Canada, you've lived in the United States and a lot of time in China as well. When you say a country that's always in motion, I get the impression that they're not standing still. Is that what you mean? They never stop moving?
That's absolutely right. I think that the US and China are very alike, in which they have grand ambitions, in which the governments have really big geopolitical ambitions, really to shape the world. That you have a lot of entrepreneurs who are very interested in building new big things, and you are constantly moving all the time. Now, I visit the UK, Europe, Japan quite often, but I feel that these are sometimes too comfortable, a little bit too cozy often, that there is not so much this spirit from entrepreneurs really to make donuts. And that is something that the Americans and the Chinese are much more eager to do, really to try out new things, whether these are EVs or new drones or anything like the batteries themselves, that they are much more optimistic, for example, on artificial intelligence.
Are we lazy in Europe?
You said that, not me. But I would say that I would really hope that the Europeans have a little bit more sense of sovereignty, a little bit more sense of geopolitical power, that they have a little bit more interest in growth. These are all things that the United States and China are both very interested in. And I think it's no surprise that they are really trying to change the world in really big ways. Now, over the summer, I spent much of July and August in the country of Denmark, which is superb in so many different ways. But something really striking to me was that over this time when I was in Europe, the European Commissioner von der Leyen went to Donald Trump in the White House after he tariffed the EU. And what was von der Leyen's response? Thank you. Thank you, we'll take another. And then the EU is stuck with these very high tariffs, even though Europe is very much an ally of the United States. And so I think that there has to be some way in order to really get greater power if you're part of Europe.
You say in your book that the only thing Europeans are optimistic about is the past. What did you mean by that?
I spend a lot of time in Austria in particular. My wife is Austrian. And when I walk through Vienna, I think that there is something really beautiful about the city of Mozart, the city of Strauss, and the city of so many wonderful different places and composers and all sorts of culture. Unfortunately, I also think that too much of Europe feels like a mausoleum economy, in which it is really geared towards driving more tourism, having a lot of visitors from the US and from China, people with a lot of money to spend, that have really hollowed out parts of Vienna, parts of Venice into big tourist sites. And what I want is a little bit more life that you can see in places like Paris, places like London, some of these other big cities. But I think there has to be a lot more energy, a lot more motion throughout this continent.
This has been a year of the Trump tariffs. President Xi stood toe to toe with the United States. Are we seeing a change in the power balance? Is China now stronger than the United States?
China has become stronger. I wouldn't say that it is stronger overall than the United States, that I think that the United States still has all sorts of advantages and all sorts of cards that it can play. Because I think that what the engineering state is really good at is building a lot of advanced manufacturing. They're building so many electric vehicles, and they're building so many of the industrial robotics that the rest of the world needs. But the US has a lot of cards of its own, that the US is maybe not a manufacturing superpower. It's long moved past that, but it is still a tech power in terms of all the AI it is creating. It is still a cultural superpower, a diplomatic superpower, a financial superpower. It has many more allies than China does. And so what I think is that even though the power balance has shifted somewhat more in China's direction, in part because of its economic growth, the US is still one of the bright centers of the world.
What do we need to know about President Xi for anyone around the world watching who dips in and out of the news and sees him pop up at various different news conferences and state visits? What would you define Xi as?
He is a deeply enigmatic person. He wears an amiable smile all the time, but he is constantly calculating. He is constantly scheming. He is somewhat improvisational. Now, and I spent 6 years living in China, and every morning I would wake up and I would try to read the mind of Xi Jinping as some people try to read the mind of God. And I think that there is something very challenging about trying to understand what really lies behind this big smile, because he is someone who is moving fast and breaking people. That there are very few people in Beijing who have any sense of how Xi Jinping thinks, whether we're looking at something like the Politburo or something within the Central Committee. I think very few of his close associates understand what's going on. And what has been really surprising this year has also been that Beijing has purged about 23 generals. These are flag officers of the People's Liberation Army who no longer have a job because of Xi Jinping's say-so. And so among some very powerful elites in Beijing, there is still quite a lot of uncertainty about how to understand him. And if the folks in Beijing don't understand him, what chance do you and I have?
So tell me, is he his own man, or is he kind of groupthink, the product of the Chinese Communist Party, that it's a collaborative effort and he just fronts up what they've decided?
He is both a product of the system. His father was one of the most senior members of the Communist Party when Mao Zedong was still around. And so he very much grew up in Beijing, surrounded by other princelings. This is the word for people whose parents were high up in the Communist Party. So he is very much a product of the system. At the same time, he has reacted against parts of the system. His predecessors shaped China to be much more open than it is now, that they were much more looking towards the United States, looking much more towards UK and Europe about what to learn about how to be a much bigger power. And Xi Jinping has decided, well, that has corrupted us. That money has corrupted too many of the Communist Party. Entrepreneurs have corrupted us, that the Americans have corrupted us. And so that is why he engaged in this big anti-corruption surge, really to try to make sure that China is going in the direction more in his mold. He is one of the hard men of Beijing. And I think that this is one of these things that is going to be very challenging for us going forward, because there is just much less understanding of what is going on, what is driving him, because he's just much more interested in closing off China from the rest of the world.
Now, you're a very respected writer and journalist. You have your own website where people can read your thoughts on China and the United States and everything else you do. You woke up one morning and your website was blocked in China.
Yes, and that was a surprise as well, that I had to immediately go see the Consul General of Canada in Shanghai and to see if I needed to leave in a hurry. And so there's all sorts of these things in China that make you slightly freaked out. I think that's the word. That, when I was living in China, one of the things I was most interested in getting were new books. And it's very difficult to order new books in China. Often that my parents would send me these 20 kilograms batches of books by post. And you never know which one might be plucked away by the censors one day. And so when you come across these sort of scary things, I think it's no surprise to me that many of China's elites have a very hard time staying in China. That imagine if you are somewhat senior inside the Communist Party or somewhat senior inside the military, you never really know when Xi Jinping will wake up in a bad mood and decides to take down your patron, in which case the entire network has to fall. And that is part of the reason that so many people have been very interested in emigrating from China, going to Europe, going to the US, going to Thailand, going to the UK, because they still have some lingering fears about staying long term there.
You've carved out a very interesting niche, being one of the very few people writing intelligently about China with great knowledge in English. Your book, Breakneck, how do you think this has gone down in Beijing?
I'm not fully sure. That I would love to know how, if Xi Jinping reads my book, I would love for him to hear his thoughts. I doubt that anyone very senior inside the Communist Party will read my book. What I really try to do in this book is to capture what is the great paradox about China today. And I think the great paradox is that we have to acknowledge two true things at the same time. The first is that China has enjoyed this surging economic growth that is totally unprecedented in humanity, which has brought over 1 billion people out of poverty, a few 100 million people into the middle class, a few million people into the global elites. We have nothing to lose by acknowledging that this is very much real growth. At the same time, by virtue of being so authoritarian in the 21st century, I think that China is pioneering all of these new and novel forms of repression that is making many people very, very upset, and that is contributing to a lot of political dissatisfaction, social exhaustion in China. And so that is always what I try to capture. Both facts are true.
The key thing I took away from your book, Dan, you make the point that the United States is run by lawyers and China is run by engineers.
Yes.
Is that what is behind this relentless construction, moving forward, buying raw earth minerals, China first? They're winning everywhere.
Well, they're winning in a lot of places. And I think that by virtue of their engineering training, Xi Jinping had his undergrad as a chemical engineer. His predecessor, Hu Jintao, was trained as a hydrology engineer. And I think that is certainly one of these aspects to understand why they are very rationalist and keenly minded to govern society as a math exercise. And so you can't build a subway system, you can't build a railway system without a considerable degree of rationalism. And China really has built enormous amounts of highways, enormous amounts of high-speed rail, which work superbly well, I would say on par with most of Europe. And so that is part of what's really motivating them, that they understand concrete, they understand steel, and they're interested in building more of it. And at the same time, I think that is contributing to a lot of social dynamism in China, because people themselves are feeling like they are being treated as just another chess piece to be moved around. I think a lot about how China imposed the one-child policy, really to control the population. But now it is telling women, go have 2 children, go have 3 children. And the women aren't necessarily cooperating because they don't love being told that your highest duty is to be carrying a child. And I think very few women appreciate that sort of message.
There's one very interesting paragraph in your book which looks at the relationship between the United States and China and possibly what's to come in decades. And I'll read what you wrote. A paramount question of our times is whether hostility between China and the United States can stay at what you call a manageable simmer, because if it boils over, they will devastate not only each other, but the world. Do you predict conflict at some stage?
I fear conflict, and I think that it is up to everyone to try to deter conflict and try to reassure both countries from engaging in conflict with each other. Now, I think that conflict is something that is that is a possibility, and I think that this is something that we really should try to avoid. And I think that it is also not an inevitability, that there is no necessary reason for the Chinese to become much more aggressive towards the United States or for the United States to become much more aggressive towards China, except for this little island called Taiwan, which hangs off not too far away from the Chinese coast, that the United States has a very clear interest in defending, that a lot of China's neighbors have a clear interest in defending, especially Japan. Japan and China are now in this totally big, almost insane diplomatic tiff, trading barbs back and forth, in which the Japanese are just saying that Taiwan they have an interest in a free Taiwan. And so these are the sort of questions in which you can identify these very noticeable frictions. And I think what we have to try to make sure is that we are able to have a world in which World War III doesn't erupt, because World War I created something like millions of deaths around the world. World War II had tens of millions, and I shudder to think of a World War III with potentially hundreds of millions.
At what point do you think Xi will make a move on Taiwan?
I think that it is not timelines driven, but it might be something more conditions driven. And so I think that right now, Xi Jinping does not feel a great need to move on Taiwan. in part because he's been so much buddies with Donald Trump. Donald Trump very much treats Xi as a leader that he respects, that he doesn't extend the same courtesy to many parts of the EU, like European Commissioner von der Leyen. And so, so long as there's a possibility that exists in Xi's mind that perhaps Donald Trump will simply gift the island of Taiwan to Beijing, then he really doesn't have to move. And so I don't think that this is necessarily something that we have to be very fearful of right now.
Do you think Xi will do this under a Trump administration or wait and see what comes next in 4 years' time?
I think that Xi Jinping has a lot of tactical patience as well as strategic patience, that he will see that if he really feels the need to move. And right now, he doesn't really see the need to move, in part because Donald Trump is a leader that is very much, let's call it, whimsical, and who might be able to just gift a lot of these things to Beijing. At the same time, Xi Jinping has been engaging in these anti-corruption purges with the People's Liberation Army. This year, he has felled something like over 20 generals of the People's Liberation Army. And that doesn't indicate that there's a near-term confidence in the military in order to go kinetic, as they say.
Dan, we hear all this talk of President Trump being a transactional president. There's always a deal to be done. If he gifts Taiwan, the phrase you've used, to China, what does he get back from Xi in return?
It is very difficult to say, but what the Chinese have offered so far has been, we'll buy a lot of soybeans. And that has been apparently enough to make Donald Trump relax some of his most hawkish stances against China. And so I wonder what else the Chinese could promise. Now, Bloomberg reported that one of the promises that was offered and proffered by Xi Jinping was, maybe we will promise to invest $1 trillion in the United States. Now, I think that number feels like fantasy. The Europeans have offered that. The Japanese have offered smaller numbers of these big sums. But these are sort of things where Xi Jinping can really flatter Donald Trump's vanity, in which and we cannot but agree that Donald Trump can be a very vain man who likes his name in big golden letters across very tall buildings. And so you never really know with someone so transactional or whimsical.
Do you think Xi likes Trump, or is this just the kind of relationship that he plays up to because he knows ultimately he can get what he wants?
I wonder if anyone likes Trump, and I wonder if Xi Jinping likes anyone.
That's a very good answer. Talk to me about electric vehicles. In Europe, we are pretty much obsessed with where this market is going and how Europe can fight back. But it strikes me that China's leading the way, and China welcomed in Volkswagen, saw what they had, and then made better vehicles.
That's right. So I think that it is really remarkable that now 1 in 2 cars sold in China is electric. And that is a milestone that they're hitting at the end of this year. By contrast, in the US, where I'm from right now, the US is selling about 1 in 10 vehicles is electric. A lot of that is Tesla. And I think a lot of people have been reacting against Mr. Musk's politics and have become much less eager to buy Tesla vehicles. But what the Chinese have done is that they have welcomed in not just Volkswagen, but also Toyota, but also Tesla, really try to get these big global companies to train Chinese workers to put together some of the best vehicles in the world. And I think the rule of thumb that I'm familiar with is that every Japanese, German, or American automaker needs something like 6 years in order to conceptualize a car and actually get that out on the road in the markets. And for China, the same time span is it takes something like 2 years or 18 months to release a new car. And so when the Chinese are working something like 3 times faster than the Americans, it's not really because that the Chinese are necessarily trying to steal anything. They're not really cheating. They didn't go hypnotize the automakers in Detroit to move slowly. That is just the fact that they are much more competitive and are making much better products now.
And the battery technology, where do you think they are with that? How far ahead are they?
Very far ahead, leading the world, that there have been all sorts of efforts to try to catch up with China on battery technologies. There was a very prominent Swedish company, Northvolt, which really tried to make electric vehicles, and they have not succeeded. I believe they folded. They went into bankruptcy a couple of years ago. And so that is one of these challenges that in some cases, China is not only the technologically superior solution, they're also the cheaper solution. In the case of electric vehicles, in the case of solar photovoltaics, usually when you ask the economists, it can't be true that both. It's very rare that both facts are true. Either you're cheaper or you're better, and that's where the competition is. The challenge with China is that often they're both cheaper and better.
When it comes to EVs in particular, do you think we've been asleep at the wheel in Europe?
I think that the Germans in particular have been asleep at the wheel, that they went really hard on going into diesels. And that was simply the wrong technology, that the Japanese also went a little bit too hard in something like hydrogen fuel cells. And that was, again, the wrong technological bet. What this was the Americans working with many parts of the Chinese, with Elon Musk's missionary zeal, really to make electric vehicle Teslas. That was the right answer, and they have won this very big bet.
Tell me, you travel so much, you speak to so many sharp people in cities who know everything that's going on. Give me your impression of where we are in Europe right now, economically.
I feel like what Europe really lacks is the sense of real craving for power, that so many of the entrepreneurs, it is really difficult for British people to name really big entrepreneurs, not because entrepreneurs don't exist in the UK, but because they're not quite valorized in the same way as the US, as in China, where Jack Ma and Elon Musk are indeed household names. And what I would really like is for there to be a little bit more of a culture of growth for Europe. Now, I do spend quite a lot of time in Europe, and something I'm quite nervous about is that, on the one hand, China is already pretty clearly deindustrializing Germany, as well as the big industrial zones of Europe. On the other hand, I think the Americans are successfully outcompeting the Europeans on things like biotech, on things like financial services, on things like AI, as well as the software firms. And what I'm quite worried about is that Europe is simply uncompetitive right next to these two big regions, that people no longer have an ethic of growth, that people are no longer very interested in growth. And I think that is something that has to change in Europe.
In the United Kingdom recently, Dan, there have been some spy scandals involving China. People allegedly working in Parliament in Westminster reporting back to Beijing. There have been scandal after scandal, and it has created a lot of newspaper headlines. Is Chinese intelligence something we should be worrying about?
I think that is something that the UK should be worrying about, but I think what should also be worrying is that, according to this case of the parliamentary spy scandal, the UK prosecutors weren't able to pursue this case because their own cases collapsed. And my understanding was that it was because the government, the national government, wasn't able to declare China a national security threat. And so this feels like a failing of the system. This feels like a failing of the legal system. Feels like a failing of the political system, in which there's charges of espionage which the government itself was not able to fulsomely pursue. And so these are the sort of things where I think that the UK has to get more serious, decide what it wants to do, and then follow these cases through if that's indeed what it wants to do.
We've also seen various different Ministry of Defence sites tell their employees who all work in the defence sector in the UK not to be using Chinese-made vehicles, not to be parking them on site. The fear is that the vehicles can be listened to or espionage can take place. Do you think that's paranoia, or is that a valid kind of fear?
I think that it is a big, scary world out there, that there are many sorts of espionage agents out there, that there's all sorts of electronic devices out there. And so I think that, and the Chinese aren't the only scary boys in town, that there's also the Russians, and perhaps more of Europe are feeling nervous about the Americans as well, now that the Americans are threatening the territorial integrity of the EU. And so I think that it is just good to have these general precautions certainly in place.
Begs the question, Dan, as we reach the end of our conversation, just tell me, what advice would you give European leaders about how to have a better relationship with China?
I think that the first question to ask is, I think the first determination is that I think that economic security is national security. And one way to have economic security is to have economic growth. And what I would really like to have is a prosperous Britain, to have a prosperous Europe, such that people feel, very much that they have leverage against not only Donald Trump, but also against Xi Jinping. That when Xi or Trump threaten them, that they have the means to respond, that they have the credibility really to respond, that they have the will to respond. And so what I'm much more interested in is to make sure that there is cheap energy, whether that is through clean sources like solar or wind. Perhaps nuclear is also an option here, that there has to be an ethic of building a lot more manufacturing capacity, because I believe that the world cannot only be services, that the Chinese have demonstrated that they're able to completely cripple foreign automakers by denying them rare earth magnets and by denying them something like active pharmaceutical ingredients. And so the Chinese have built a lot of stuff, and I think that I'm very interested in a West, liberal democracies that have the ability to build and have the ability to hold their own ground against authoritarian powers.
Just finally, Dan, does China respect countries like the UK, France, and Germany, or does it see them as places that can just do business and walk all over?
I think that they would respect these bigger European countries if they were able to be banded together. Now, individually, Germany has a population of 80 million people. France is closer to 70 million. The UK is 60 million. And so individually, they don't hold a candle to the United States or China. But collectively, they're much bigger markets. They offer some sort of ingenuity that the Chinese do want. And so I'm much more interested in having a little bit more unity and a little bit more consensus, as well as a much greater commitment to growth to demonstrate to China that Europeans aren't only a mausoleum economy.
Dan Wang, thank you so much for making time on your busy schedule around Europe this week to join us on Roundtable. We will see you again, sir. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.